That girl isn't worth $300,000. A family doesn't spend money on a loss. My father said that when Lily needed money for a bone marrow transplant. 12 days later, he signed a guarantee for $1.2 million so my brother could expand the family company. The same signature, the same pen. Only the name on the paper was different. That day, I understood they weren't short on money. They were just short on space for my child in what they called a legacy. Lily needed $300,000 within 48 hours to keep her last chance at treatment. That was the fragile line my father coldly brushed aside. I called my parents from the hospital hallway, where fear had clung to me for weeks. I looked through the ICU window. Lily lay there, small and fragile among the tangled support equipment. I believed them. If you're listening to Claire tell this story from your kitchen, your living room, or your car after work, let me know where you are. I want to know how many people have heard the words, family has to be realistic the way I did. If this story makes you pause, hit like and stay with me until the end. Don't leave. Because what I discovered next wasn't just alone. 48 hours passed. When the doctor walked out, all I heard were the words, "We tried." 3 months later, I went back to the bank in downtown Boston. The name Donovan Construction never officially appeared on my desk, but in the internal risk management system I had access to, the $1.2 million figure showed up like a streak of blood. My father had used his personal reputation as collateral. I printed the file at 8 p.m. when the office lights were off and placed it next to the fax requesting medical assistance for Lily that he had refused. That night, I drove back to the old house in the suburbs of Newton. The grandfather clock in the living room ticked steadily as if no one had ever left for good. Mark was talking about plans to expand into New Hampshire. No one mentioned Lily. On the way home, I called the insurance records department to request copies of any policies in my daughter's name. The woman on the other end asked for the policy number. I told her I'd never received one. There was a brief silence. Then she read the number, $500,000, dispersed 4 weeks after Lily died. I pulled over. The traffic light ahead shifted from green to yellow, and that was when I knew Lily had a life insurance policy I had never been told about. I sat in the car for a few more minutes before turning back toward my apartment in Back Bay. The light changed again and again. $500,000, dispersed 4 weeks after the funeral. The number wasn't small, but it was so cold it dried out my throat. The next morning, I traced the insurance funds. The beneficiary name that appeared made my chest tighten. Donovan Legacy Holdings, my brother's company. My daughter's money hadn't disappeared. It had just changed hands. Donovan Legacy Holdings was the entity behind Mark's entire expansion project. I pulled my chair closer to the screen. The funds were transferred from the insurance company to Legacy Holdings' account exactly 28 days after Lily was buried at Mount Auburn Cemetery. It had drizzled that day. I remember because the carnations were pressed into the mud. I remembered my trembling hands signing papers at the ICU intake desk. I thought I was signing documents to save my child. I didn't know I was signing a contract allowing them to turn her death into a number on a financial scale. I flipped through my brother's loan file. Under collateral, my daughter's name appeared as a liquid asset. For my child to grow cold. They pawned her for my child to grow cold. They pawned her life for Mark's career. They didn't wait for my grief to settle. They turned the loss of a child into a financial tool to salvage Mark's career. In their eyes, Lily's death was the perfect financial instrument. I printed everything, stapled it in chronological order, slipped it into a gray folder. I didn't call my parents. I didn't text Mark. The first thing was to review the insurance file from beginning to end. On page 3 of the policy, the medical history disclosure had been altered by an addendum added after the policy was already active. The date on the addendum was almost a year before Lily was hospitalized. The pre-existing conditions section had been crossed out and replaced with a more vague phrase. I stared at that line for a long time. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I knew where it could lead if examined closely. I closed the folder. The wall clock in my office struck 4 p.m. The steady ticking sounded exactly like the grandfather clock at my parents' house. And for the first time since the funeral, I no longer felt like I was standing outside this story. I still sat at those Sunday dinners, thick with furniture polish and lies. I watched Mark enthusiastically talk about the Providence Project. I watched my father boast about the family reputation, while my purse held proof that they had sold Lily's life to buy those bricks. No one mentioned legacy holdings. No one mentioned Lily. At the bank, I kept my position. Donovan Construction's files crossed my desk more than before. Mark was borrowing beyond safe limits to expand 3 projects at once. The debt-to-equity ratio was climbing fast. Cash flow reports showed liquidity pressure beginning. Numbers don't lie. They just wait for someone willing to look at them. My father mortgaged the house in Newton and a vacation property in Cape Cod to strengthen his guarantee file. His personal assets were tied to the $1.2 million loan, like a rope binding the whole family to the same stake. I reviewed the collateral updates in the system, saving each version by date. One evening, I returned to the old house while Mark and my mother were still on the phone in the kitchen. The living room was empty. The grandfather clock stood tall against the wall, the minute hand touching 6 p.m. I walked over, opened the small glass door, and gently held the pendulum still. The ticking stopped. The room fell silent. It was the first time in 40 years that clock had stopped running. I closed the door as if nothing had happened. The next morning, I signed a consulting agreement with a financial attorney in Beacon Hill. He didn't ask much about emotions. He asked about documents. I placed the gray folder on the table and opened it page by page. The insurance contract. Wording here is very convenient. I asked him to review the entire medical disclosure process. If there were changes, there had to be confirmed signatures and clear timestamps. If not, the contract could be reevaluated. That night, I reopened Lily's scanned policy on my personal computer. In the lower corner of the addendum page, the ink was slightly darker than the rest. The printed date used a different font from the first page. Small details, but enough to make me sit up straight. I closed the laptop. This time I wasn't on the sidelines. 3 weeks after I handed the insurance contract to the attorney, my phone vibrated at 2:14 a.m. My father's name appeared on the screen. I heard sirens cutting through the night in his voice. Mark had a major incident at the construction site. It's urgent. You need to come to the hospital. I put on my coat and drove across the Longfellow Bridge while the city was still wrapped in fog. The emergency room was crowded. Workers stood in small groups, pale-faced. A safety manager was being asked to stay by police for questioning. A warning sign lay broken in the wind. Mark's project had collapsed. Literally. A serious incident had occurred at the site due to negligence in supervision and dishonesty about safety compliance. The next morning, local news ran a story about serious safety violations at a Donovan construction project. 3 workers' families filed a collective complaint. Their attorney demanded compensation and a full investigation. The company's risk rating spiked in a single day. At the bank, the risk management department called an emergency meeting. The $1.2 million loan for Donovan Construction was placed under review. If the lawsuits escalated, the bank had the right to seize collateral. I sat in the glass conference room and listened as each number was repeated. 1.2 million principal, 320,000 in projected interest, collateral including the house in Newton and the Cape Cod property. A signature once saved a company, but it didn't save a child. Now it could destroy everything. That afternoon, my father called again. His voice was rougher than usual. Family has to stick together, Claire. You have a position at the bank. You know how they think. You have to help Mark. I went to Massachusetts General Hospital at the end of visiting hours. Mark lay in bed, his leg cast up to his hip. My mother sat beside him, eyes red. My father stood by the window, looking out at the Charles River. He spoke directly. The bank is preparing to call the loan. If they do, we lose everything. You can delay the review process. You just need to sign the internal proposal. The proposal was in my hands. A thin sheet of papers, a few short lines requesting a 90-day extension before reassessment. If I signed, I would put myself in a conflict of interest. I set the paper down on the chair beside Mark's bed and looked at my father longer than usual. My father said, "Family has to stand together." On one side was my brother's career and the family name. On the other was the truth about my daughter's death. If you were in that moment, would you stay silent to protect your family or risk losing everything to reclaim justice? Let me know your perspective. "I'll help," I said calmly. He exhaled as if he'd been waiting for that. I picked the paper up again and folded it in half. "But this time, Dad, you'll have to sign again." I placed the extension proposal on the table beside Mark's hospital bed, then pulled a thin, prepared file from my purse. "You want my signature?" I said, looking straight at my father. "Then here are my conditions." My mother stood abruptly. Mark tried to sit up, but the cast made him grit his teeth. The hospital room was bright white, the steady beep of the heart monitor reminding us time was still ticking. "From now on, Donovan Legacy Holdings will undergo an independent audit," I said. "Everything, including the $500,000 from Lily's insurance policy." No one spoke for a few seconds. Then Mark let out a dry laugh. "Have you lost your mind? This is when you demand an audit?" "All next quarter's shareholder reports must publicly disclose that allocation," I continued, steady and slow, "and 40% of the family shares will be transferred into a new fund, named the Lilly Foundation." Mark slammed his hand against the bed rail. "You're pushing your own family into a corner?" I turned the file toward them. She wasn't a loss. The room was so quiet we could hear a gurney rolling down the hallway. My mother covered her mouth. My father looked at the papers, his eyes moving across the bold lines. "Claire, this isn't the time," he began. "It is exactly the time," I cut in. "If the bank calls the loan, the collateral will go to auction. If the safety investigation expands, financial records will be reviewed. And if the insurance file is reopened," I let the sentence hang. Mark looked at me as if he had never seen me before. "Are you threatening to drag Mom and Dad into legal trouble?" "I'm stating facts," I replied evenly. "The health disclosure addendum was altered after the original signing date. If insurance regulators step in, they'll ask questions, and they won't stop at one." My father sat down. For the first time, he didn't immediately argue. He flipped through the file page by page, the numbers, the dates, the signatures. "All I'm asking for," I said slowly, "is transparency, an independent audit, public disclosure of the funds, creation of a foundation in Lily's name to support families needing bone marrow transplants. You sign this, and I'll sign the 90-day extension." Mark shook his head. "You're betraying us." I looked at him. "Betrayal is using the death of a child as a shield for your own mistakes." No one raised their voice anymore. The tension didn't need shouting. My father set the pen down on the small table by the bed. He looked at me, then at the audit and share transfer document. This time he didn't ask about the numbers. My father didn't ask anything else. He signed. 3 days later, I sat in the attorney's office in Beacon Hill. Boston had turned cold early. Through the window, red maple leaves covered the sidewalk. Vanessa placed a thick stack of documents on the table and flipped to a page marked with a yellow tab. "We compared the original file with the version held by the insurance company," she said. "There were edits in the medical history section." I looked at the two printed copies side by side. One listed all of Lily's hospitalizations for congenital heart complications. The other, the version sent to the insurance company, simply stated routine cardiac monitoring. The details were gone. "The edit date was 3 months before Lily died," Vanessa continued. "The policy value increased from $300,000 to $500,000 after that update." I didn't ask who made the change. The answer had already been in that hospital room. If regulators review it, they'll question the false disclosure. And if the contract is voided, the full disbursed amount could be clawed back, along with a fraud investigation. My father came to the office that afternoon. He sat across from me, hands resting on the dark wood table. For the first time, I saw him avoid eye contact. I just adjusted it to make sure the policy would be approved, he said quietly. Everyone does it. Insurance companies always look for ways to deny claims. You used that policy as collateral for a bridge loan before Lily died, Vanessa said, turning another page. We have documentation. The room fell silent. I looked at the small print at the bottom of the mortgage agreement. Collateral assignment, minor beneficiary policy. When a child becomes collateral, everything else is just numbers. The $500,000 wasn't simply compensation after the funeral. It had been pledged as leverage to expand Donovan Construction's credit line. That meant before Lily left this world, her policy had already been used as a tool. My father rubbed his forehead. I didn't think it would go this far. I slid another set of documents toward him. This is the final notice. An independent audit begins within 7 days. All collateral will be restructured under the terms we signed. Otherwise, this file will be forwarded to the appropriate authorities. He looked up. You're pushing this family to the edge. You did that a long time ago. Vanessa set her watch on the table. 72 hours, she said. My father stood up slowly. The door closed behind him. 72 hours isn't long, but it's enough for a legacy to collapse or be rewritten. The emergency shareholder meeting was held Monday morning in the conference room on the 18th floor. Glass walls overlooking the Charles River, the sky gray and heavy like cold metal. I walked in holding the folder and a small wooden box. Mark sat at the head of the table, still on crutches. My father was to his right, my mother seated slightly behind. The other shareholders, mostly longtime family partners, exchanged brief, cautious glances. I stepped into the meeting and threw the gray folder onto the center of the table. No slides. I read aloud 2 dates. The day Lily died and the day my father used her insurance money to save the company. The room went silent. I looked straight at him. You said family has to be realistic, so is the reality that you sold your granddaughter to keep that chair? I didn't explain further. I simply read the 2 milestones again. The cruelty laid bare. An older shareholder removed his glasses and bent down to review the printed documents in front of him. The current legal risks fall into 3 areas, I continued. Internal audit, workplace safety investigation, insurance contract review. Mark leaned forward. You're destroying the company when we're at our weakest. I'm preventing it from collapsing completely, I replied. A board member requested temporary suspension of Mark's executive authority until the audit was complete. The motion went to a vote. Hands rose, slow but clear. Mark was suspended as CEO. I opened the wooden box I had brought. Inside was the small pendulum clock I had removed from the old living room. I placed it at the center of the table. The hands were still moving. Time remembers, I said. We can't continue as if nothing happened. I presented the prepared agreement. 40% of the family shares would be transferred to Lilly Foundation, an independent, transparent fund overseen by an external board. The clause already carried my father's signature from the hospital. All eyes turned to him. He picked up the pen. He didn't look at me. He signed again in front of everyone. No handcuffs, no police sirens. But the room shifted. Donovan Legacy Holding stock dropped 18% during afternoon trading. Several contracts were paused pending review. Investors demanded more detailed reports. When the meeting ended, Mark remained seated alone at the long table. My mother followed my father out, her shoulders visibly thinner. I stood by the window looking down at the traffic below. Justice isn't loud, it's just a signature placed correctly. The small pendulum clock kept ticking. I knew that from that day on, the rest of my family had changed. 3 weeks after the meeting, I received an email from the bank's HR department. Short, polite, neutral. Due to conflict of interest and direct involvement in restructuring a strategic client, my position would be under review. 2 days later, the official termination notice arrived. My employment was ended. I signed the document transfer record without arguing. The 18th floor office reflected a fading autumn sky. When I walked out of the building, my employee badge had already been deactivated. My family went silent in their own way. No calls, no messages. Mark gradually recovered from surgery. Internal reports said he would not return to an executive role. The board appointed an external interim CEO. Donovan Construction laid off 30% of its workforce to stabilize cash flow. The Newton house was sealed. My father, the man who worshipped the word legacy his entire life, stood watching a for sale sign hang over the front gate. Mark wandered through financial circles trying to salvage what remained of his reputation. The greatest punishment wasn't losing assets. It was the emptiness when they realized the legacy they tried to protect had already rotted from within. Lilly Foundation officially launched early the following year. A small rented office, 2 full-time employees, an independent oversight board. The first 3 cases were approved for bone marrow transplant deposits. $180,000 were dispersed to a family in Worcester, $95,000 to a little girl in Providence. Specific numbers, no metaphors. I stood in my new rental apartment in Cambridge and removed the small pendulum clock from its box. The old mechanism had stopped the day I brought it to the meeting. I set it on the kitchen table, opened the back, and replaced the movement with a new one I bought at an antique shop on Charles Street. The hour hand shifted slightly when I inserted the battery. I leaned against the wall and listened to the steady ticking. I had cut off one part of my life to preserve another. Winning or losing was no longer measured in shares or titles. Some evenings were so quiet they felt hollow. Justice isn't warm, it's simply direct. I looked at the clock. New hands, old wood. Time continues, just not the same way. I was no longer the silent daughter in a room that smelled of polished wood. I was no longer the bank employee with the gleaming badge. I was someone responsible for her choices. The clock kept running. The first bone marrow transplant funded by Lilly Foundation took place on a cold morning in late March at Boston Children's Hospital. The case had been approved 2 weeks earlier. A 4-year-old girl named Ava. Rare blood type. Her family couldn't afford the deposit to secure the transplant slot within 48 hours. The foundation transferred $182,400 within 1 business day. I stood outside the pre-op room, leaning against a pale cream wall. Ava's mother sat on a plastic chair, gripping the strap of her purse with both hands. When the doctor announced the surgery time, she nodded slightly, her lips trembling but not crying. The child wore a hospital gown printed with dolphins, her hair tied to one side, the door closed. I didn't step any further inside. No one needed to know who I was. Lily's name appeared only on the funding confirmation attached to the medical file. The hallway was long, fluorescent lights bright overhead. At the far end, a round clock hung high on the wall, its second hand moving steadily. The ticking was faint but clear in the quiet between nurses' footsteps. I stood there for a long time. The doctor came out 3 hours later. The transplant was initially successful, he said. We'll monitor for rejection. This time, the mother cried. She hugged the doctor, then clutched her coat as if holding something solid. I watched through the space between 2 people. No one looked at me. I didn't feel triumph, no sense of victory, just a small pocket of peace deep enough to breathe. Lilly Foundation received 12 additional applications that month. 6 were approved, 4 were pending medical review, 2 were declined due to ineligibility. Specific numbers, no embellishment. That evening, I returned to my apartment in Cambridge. The small pendulum clock on the kitchen shelf was still running. The new hands were a shade brighter than the old wood. I placed my hand on the glass and felt the faint vibration. My family didn't call, no messages. Afternoons, I walked past the park near the Charles River. Children ride bicycles, adults read newspapers on benches. Life doesn't know about the numbers that once kept me awake. I stand by the railing and watch the water. Something was lost. Something is being rebuilt. Not perfectly balanced, just enough. The clock in the hospital is still ticking today, and somewhere a child has been given more time. I think that's enough for today. That spring, I returned to the hospital once more. Not because of a crisis, not for a meeting, just to sit in the familiar hallway and listen to the ticking of the wall clock. I reclaimed the truth. But the cost wasn't small. The family as I once knew it no longer exists. Sunday dinners, the big house, my father's armchair, all belong to an old chapter. People ask if I regret it. The answer isn't simple. Justice doesn't come with warmth. It's cold and clear. It cuts away what's rotten, but leaves an empty space behind. I learned that a boundary isn't revenge. It's a thin but necessary line between dignity and endurance. When I signed those documents, I didn't just restructure a company, I restructured the way I exist. There were years I stayed silent, thinking it kept the peace. But silence in the face of wrongdoing can become complicity. I didn't speak when Lily was called a loss, and the cost of that silence was too high. Now I don't carry hatred. I simply no longer measure my worth by how others see me. My family chose to protect a legacy. I chose to protect my daughter's memory. Some nights I stand in front of the small pendulum clock in my kitchen. The new hour hand brighter than the old wood. Time doesn't go backward, but it continues. And most important, I can think of Lily without lowering my head in shame. No longer feeling as though I stood still too long. Just a grief softened by time. The story you just heard is a work of fiction, inspired by real-life situations where money, family, and self-respect can collide fiercely. The content was supported by AI and edited by humans to offer reflection and emotional value. I do not encourage anyone to take extreme actions in real life. Every situation requires careful consideration. If there is one thing I want to hold on to after all of this, it is this. Your value should not be priced by someone else. Not by a signature, not by a number. A boundary doesn't make you heartless. It helps you protect your dignity. If you stayed until this moment, I'm truly grateful. What moment of your life are you listening to this story in? Leave a line below. I read every comment. If you believe boundaries are necessary, even when they come at a cost, press like and subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that they are not a loss in anyone's life. Thank you for listening. Your presence here means more than you think.